Hello, everybody. Just want to warn you all that this is new for me to record a PowerPoint, but I'm going to give it a whirl. You guys have been working the last few days on your slavery and immigration assignments, and what I'm going to do here is just kind of blow through this PowerPoint just to, I guess, explain some of the answers you might have gotten wrong and also give you a chance to fix your notes because in the end we're going to have an open note test over all this stuff. Um, I hope everyone's doing well, and please email if you have any questions as we go through this process because I have a feeling we're going to be doing this for quite a while more, and the more feedback I get from you guys, the better. So, all right, like I said, I'll try to go quick through this because I know you don't want to sit here and hear me talk for 40 minutes just like normal. Um, this first, I guess, chart that we were looking at here just gives you an example of how many people were actually coming into our country. And this unit itself, we're looking at two different things here, really. Immigration, which is going to be more of a northern part of the country focus, and then slavery, where we're really talking about southern life. So rather than call it north and south, I called it slavery and immigration because those are the two big issues going on right now in those two areas. So we're going to start with immigration here first, looking at just, again, numbers, what's going on. And I think we can relate with all the immigration talk today. And always, I mean, there's always immigration discussion in our country. But the big groups to be coming at that time were from Germany and Ireland in particular. You still had quite a few from England too. And I had you guys with this first question just combine England and Ireland's numbers. So 58% of the people coming, or 214,600 in that time, came from England and Ireland. Conclusions that you guys might have come up with. You didn't know really a lot about this on this first slide or first chart that we looked at, and so I was just to get you thinking a little bit prior knowledge wise. What do you know? What was going on? And some of you mentioned the Irish potato famine. A lot of you guys just said, clearly something was going on in Europe at that time. I didn't expect any correct answers here as long as you had something that made sense. You guys watched a video. We're not going to do that here, but here's the questions that I had set up for you. When did immigration in the U.S. begin to pick up? It was about the 1830s. And comparing the two main groups, Ireland and Germany, the Irish, you're talking about some of the poorest people in the world. The reason they're coming here is they're starving. I mean, they lived on potatoes. Potatoes was their main thing. And when the potato crop started to fail, they had to get out of there. And they used whatever savings they had to get here. Most of them had no actual skills for factory living, they were farmers. And so they mostly came here as unskilled laborers, built railroads, canals, and worked in mill towns and ports. Where the Germans, a lot of these people on money, they came here because there were political issues in their country. They were actually forming the country Germany at this time. By 1869, Germany will exist, but up to this point, it's not. I mean, there is no German country. It's a bunch of independent countries. So most of those people had money, were able to move west and go farm. Others had, skills. They were craftsmen, carpenters, things like that, and they were able to get jobs in those areas. The number jumps incredibly from 1830 to 1850 to 170,000, and that was kind of the peak of that Irish potato famine. This shows that same thing. And I had you guys write what you're observing here, and there's really no way you can get it wrong. I mean, what do you see? The peak year, 427,833 in 1850. Again, the peak of that Irish potato famine. And you can see once that ended, it dropped really quickly. Also, keep in mind that in 1860, the Civil War is going to start. So people aren't going to be so inclined to move here when we're going into a war. So that might be something else. No one, I don't think anybody actually mentioned that on here, but that is one thing that, you don't see here that maybe if you knew when the war started, that would have made sense. But I do like this chart. It shows how quickly things take off here. Okay, the second day you look more at cities, and these are again northern cities. And you had a couple questions, or sorry, not questions. You had to do two things here for each paragraph out of the book. The first paragraph, or first thing, you were supposed to come up with an overall statement or like a topic sentence for the paragraph. And then the second part is you were supposed to list a couple facts. And these facts are going to be what to look for on the test. So if this is different than what you have in your notes, you might want to go back and fix what's in your notes. So, like it said, the first cities were growing along the waterways in 1820 to 1860. It gave you some examples of cities, and this is exactly what I had in your notes anyway, so I don't think we need to go through the whole thing here. There's a potato up there with the potato blight. So again, it's not people that are getting sick like coronavirus. It's the potatoes that are actually sick. And so without their food supply, they had some issues. So the thing that it had, like I said, is the potato blight. And that lasted from 1840 to 1860. And it took about 10 years before people started to leave. And just these numbers are pretty staggering. 1.5 million people came from 1846 to 1860. It gets so bad that there's more Irish people living in New York City than in Dublin, which is the capital of Ireland. The second largest group to come would be from Germany. I already explained why they came, escaping political problems, coming to get work. The impact of this, like any new group that comes and why we are considered a melting pot, is that these immigrants bring with them, of course, their culture. And we have so many different cultures that make up the United States or American culture. These people brought their religions, especially the Catholic religion at this time. Almost every Irish person who came here was a Catholic. There weren't all that many Catholics here before that. You also had the Germans who were either Lutheran or Catholic, and that brought up both of those. People in England were Anglican or Church of England. And so these two groups brought two, predominant religions that are here today in very large numbers, and also their traditions. And you can see the guy there, St. Patrick's Day was just last week. That's obviously a tradition that comes from Ireland. So there's those numbers I was talking about for their religion. Obviously, just like today, people who are in the United States aren't necessarily fond all the time of immigrants coming in. And in the 1830s and 40s, immigration groups already had started to form, and they blamed any of the problems on society on immigrants. You hear that stuff from Trump and others, about, all the criminals and the drug dealers that are coming in. Well, those same arguments were brought up by nativists, is what they called themselves, that they were the true Native Americans. What's funny is none of them were actual Native Americans. They were all people who trace their ancestry back to England, so they're the real Americans. Kind of goofy. They called themselves a know-nothing party because if they were asked anything about anything that happened, they would say, I know nothing. And that name kind of stuck. This eventually became a political party, and they ran for president even, as well as multiple other offices. And there you go. That's how they got their name. I'm sorry about the loud clicking. I just realized that's probably annoying. A couple of graphs I wanted you to look at. It might not seem overly extreme here to jump 12% in 40 years, but what they're really saying here is these are immigrants who, this is a large percentage of our population that are not naturalized citizens. So people who have come here and are going through the process of becoming citizens. For the longest time before 1820, you could just come here. There weren't requirements to become a citizen. But through the 1820s and on, they started to increase more restrictions on these immigrants too. We had our city life video. I kind of skipped over that. And again, you were supposed to examine those pictures. And a lot of you guys did a great job of just noticing, how dirty and crowded the cities actually were at the time. And it would have been miserable. That nobody wanted to stay in New York City. But if you were stuck, because you're from Ireland, you don't have any other skills besides maybe working in a factory now, your chances to move on just weren't there. All right, the second half of this, we were looking at slavery then. And this chart, I remember the first time I saw it, I was shocked by some of these numbers because when you think of Southern life, you may know very little about the war, the Civil War, but we know about slavery, and you all probably have an image that pops in your head of, what did it look like, and you almost always viewed slaves and people being whipped and and working in plantations and picking cotton. But it's actually a very small percentage of population that actually owned these plantations. Um, a lot of people got number one wrong here. Percentage of population that was white. Both the red, these two both are whites. So you had to combine the two, 66%. Right up here it says 4 million African Americans remained in slavery. A lot of you got that wrong and put 32%. It's not a percent, it's asking you how many, and that's 4 million. The percentage of the population that was African American, you got to combine both the free and the slave population. Not every African American in the South was a slave. I hear students a lot talking about even those in the North, and calling African Americans in the North slaves. Well, they weren't, obviously. Only the slaves that were in the South were slaves. There were many African Americans who were not enslaved. 17% of the population, again, were these white slaveholders, and those white slaveholders, most of them only owned one or two slaves. You had a very small percentage of the population, roughly 4% of those people. So out of that, you take that 17% chunk here, only 4% of this group owned plantations with more than 100 slaves on them, over 24 slaves on them. So it's a very small chunk of the population, but it's a very powerful part of the population that runs everything. So, like I said, you should have been a little surprised by those numbers. 1/3 of the population actually was slaves. And when you're going to go into a war, the North has this huge population, and you're talking about the South, only 8 million people really make up the population that would fight in the war, because obviously slaves aren't going to want to fight. This chart shows you the effect that cotton production had on America, or more importantly, the effect it's going to have on slavery too. It becomes the business in our country, cotton production. The other thing that I do if we were in school, each of these little circles here gets bigger as well. So this is actually probably a very small circle here, and 7.1% of that was cotton in 1800. That's when you had to pick the seeds by hand. Well, now we have the cotton gin in 1820. We're producing, though, other goods too. So this circle is probably bigger than this circle, and now 32% of that, because we can mass produce the cotton with the cotton gin, is in cotton production. 1840 is going to be even a bigger circle now, and 51% of that is cotton. By 1860, we have industry in the North going crazy. So the circle for 1860 is probably, humongous, and 57.5% of that is cotton. So the amount of cotton we're producing from here to here is way more than it looks. It's only 6% more, but the amount that we're producing is, I don't even have a number for you, but it's huge because of the amount of other things we're producing too, and farm goods that we're producing. So the U.S. is really taking off by 1860. So most of you guys mentioned, that it jumped from 7 to 58%, and then the other effect here is, of course, there's going to be more slaves. So why was industry not developed in the South? Well, there's a lot of reasons. They had slaves, and they had plantations, and they weren't going to change that. They weren't going to change their way of life. It would have cost a lot of money to build factories, and so most of them just stuck with what they had, agriculture, especially cotton farms. And if you had extra money, rather than build a factory, you'd buy more slaves or more land. So, like I said, 32%, 33% of the population, they're slaves and didn't have money. And then you have to understand that most of those white people that we talked about, the 49%, were poor farmers. They didn't have money to buy, to start factories. So it just wasn't really even an option in the South. This map is also really interesting. It just shows how much the cotton boom affected the South. And they literally, that's their thing. They go from those small little pockets, where really every state had a little bit, really Florida, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky were the only ones that didn't have any, Texas too, I suppose. But then by 1860, every state in the South had some cotton, and then some of the states, it's literally everywhere. So it really takes off by 1860. And the cotton gin would have been the main reason for that increase again. So last one, this is really the notes part. Most of you guys did just fine on this. So I've already talked quite a bit here. And I'm sure on a Monday morning, the last thing you want to do is hear a half-hour lecture by me, but here we are. Like I just said, most Southerners were poor and didn't own slaves. And those people were divided up, and this is again Southern whites that we're really talking about here for the most part. But they were either a yeoman farmer, a tenant farmer, poor, like a traveling worker, or a plantation owner, and that's not in the order that they'd have as far as power is concerned. Here we have a couple of yeoman farmers. Notice they're African American farmers, and this is more recent, so you're talking closer to 1900. But these are people who owned small farms, usually 50 to 200 acres, and just normal farmers. And that's what the majority of the population in the South would have been at this time. Tenant farmers would be doing the same thing here, but instead of owning their small amount of land, they rented it, usually paying off by the crops they sell or just a rental payment at the end of the year. The plantations were, again, the big shots, the big wigs. They owned several thousand acres, but again, only 4% of all slave owners owned more than 20 slaves. I said 24 earlier, 20. I'm not going back to edit it. So by 1860, you're talking about a very small percentage of the population controlling everything in the South. Term you guys had, fixed costs. Those are operating costs that remain the same throughout the year. And those are, that's money that plantation owners expected to pay. Cotton prices had a huge effect on plantation success year to year because those prices are going to obviously fluctuate, and everything is decided on that. And if you had a bad year, you were going to lose workers, slaves, and land. If you had good years, you could purchase more slaves and more land. As far as wives and more than anything, the enslaved workers too on the plantations, what did they do? For most of the wives, they were in charge of the household, watched over the slaves and domestic workers in the house. If you had a big enough plantation, you would have slaves that worked in the kitchen and in the house as well. They kept financial records. Usually the husband would be gone, the plantation owner. He traveled quite a bit. Usually they'd be involved in politics. For enslaved workers, obviously it's misery and, sun up to sundown, working in the fields. And a movie, and I'll talk about this more later, that I'll offer for extra credit, but we have to be really careful and make sure it's with parents, is 12 Years a Slave. And I'll show you guys a preview for that later, have it in your notes. So we'll get to that as we go here. But yeah, for most, there's no chance of freedom. And you can see these guys in the picture. This is, pre-1860, the kind of job that they would have. That big basket that they're filling up, that'd be at the end of a row. You'd go fill your own bag, and you can see this guy's wearing a bag here. And you dump that into the baskets, and after your basket was full, somebody else would take that in and they'd start a new one, and you'd be required to fill so many of these baskets throughout the day, or you'd be punished. The biggest fear, though, isn't being whipped or any of those things. It's being separated from your family, and this happened all the time. It wasn't supposed to, but there weren't any laws that were going to guarantee that they'd be kept together either. Marriages wouldn't be recognized by law, so you couldn't say, hey, we're married, you can't separate us. They still did. And then because it happened so frequently, people expected that if a child was separated from a parent, an aunt or uncle or a friend would take care of their kid for them at the plantation or the next one they were going to. Kind of like I said with immigrants, though, African Americans also brought with them their cultures too. And at 1808, there were no new slaves brought in from Africa, and so a way for these African Americans that lived here to keep their histories alive, they would They used music, dance, stories, their clothing styles to keep their traditions. Many of them turned to Christianity as a hope for their freedom, and most of the slave uprisings that'll occur for like Nat Turner, though they're religious based. But Christianity and equality that Christianity preached were things that they really turned to for hope that they could one day gain their freedom. They would sing songs while they worked, and these songs served a lot of different purposes. One, again, to keep these stories going, but also they could communicate with each other secretly. That could be from plantation to plantation, but it's more so they could talk about what they're doing at that time, or updates on people, other slaves on the plantation. Um, Slave codes, black codes, whatever you want to call them. I know they use both words in the book. The goal of this, and it makes sense if you look at it from the white Southern owners side of the thing here. The worst thing that could happen is allowing slaves to be educated and to communicate with each other, because they're going to obviously realize that their situation isn't fair and that they should revolt. We saw those numbers already, 32% of the population versus 17%. It'd be, if they could all band together, a pretty easy win, you'd think, for the slaves to take out the slave owners. Now, in all reality, that 49% of the population that didn't own slaves were still majority racist and for slavery. So it's not like you would only be fighting the 17%. But the goal of the slave codes for slave owners was to stop large assemblies and allowing slaves to move from place to place freely. So they had to have written passes, and you couldn't teach slaves to read and write. It still happened, but it was very rare. Or it was rare, and they weren't supposed to do it. There were examples of resistance. Probably the most famous, in 1831, Nat Turner rebelled. This was in Southampton County, Virginia, where 55 whites were killed. You would think that this maybe would have had a positive effect, that other slaves maybe would have revolted, but instead it had a negative effect, and more black codes were put on to the slaves, and there was just less trust between slave owners and the slaves. And so rather than try to rebel because it was impossible to even meet together, or if there was even a chance that you would be planning a rebellion, there was very harsh punishments. You'd usually be killed or lynched or something and be used as an example of what not to do. So they started to do other things like not work as hard, burn down buildings, break tools, pretend they're sick, as ways to rebel and make slavery not as profitable. A couple examples of people who were able to escape slavery: Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. They'll both become leaders in the anti-slavery or abolitionist movement. Harriet Tubman famously will go back and forth into the South and save people, and then becomes a leader of the Underground Railroad as well. If we were in school, we'd watch the movie Harriet, and I do offer that also for extra credit right now for this quarter. So Harriet and 12 Years a Slave are two movies that I'll, as of now, offer for extra credit. So if you do get those, parents just need to email me that you did that. But last thing, southern cities, how are they different from northern cities? Well, first off, there weren't many of them, and if they did have big cities, they were usually along the waterways and along their few railroad tracks that they had. A lot of the cities and smaller towns were, not a lot, but there were towns of all African Americans, because people who were free and not enslaved would want to stay together so that they're not accused of being runaways. And so they would form their own neighborhoods in the large cities and even form their own small towns. Education was an issue in Southern society. It was usually on your own. Things were spread out a little more than in the North. And so they had a far lower literacy rate than the North did. But anyway, that is kind of where we're at here as far as our North and South comparison. As I mentioned, you'll have an open note test on Thursday. So use this PowerPoint to kind of go back through your own notes, make sure you have the right answers down, and you should be ready to go. You'll also be getting a web quest this week that Mr. Schmidt's putting together, and you'll have a couple days to work on that, and test will be Thursday, and then Friday we'll start looking at our causes of the Civil War. So feel free to email me if you have any questions going forward, and I'll hope to hear from you soon.